So this morning is the auction sermon, purchased by John and Susan Smith. And for some of you, that may not make any sense, so let me explain what that means. Traditionally, the church has an annual fundraising auction, and the minister contributes an item called a sermon on the topic of your choice. The winning bidder gets to choose the sermon topic and present it to the preacher, who then preaches a sermon on that topic. Typically, of course, it would be the senior minister who presents the auction sermon. But when the auction planning kicked into gear this year, Reverend Neil had already announced his departure, and Reverend Christine had not yet been selected. So the auction committee turned to me as the most frequent guest in your pulpit recently and offered me the honor, and an honor it is. Now, John and Susan handed me a wonderfully rich topic, asking me to preach on the theme of optimism. John said he is a congenital optimist, but he'd been thinking about how many different dimensions and perspectives the idea has, with both virtues and pitfalls. So he invited me to ponder that vast territory of thought and try to carve out a piece of it for closer examination. It's an interesting time to be reflecting on optimism as the pandemic continues to rage around us, even as we see vaccine supplies increasing. Today, we are painfully aware that it has been 364 days since our last in-person gathering in this building. A year is a long time. And we're painfully aware of the losses we've experienced during the past year. Obviously, the loss of life is the most dramatic of those, but also losses of income, of security, of human connection and touch, of opportunities. When the shutdown first began a year ago, many of us felt optimistic that it would be a short-term situation and that our lives would soon be back to normal. And as time went on, many of us lost that initial optimism as the seriousness of the situation began to sink in. At the same time, many of us have paid more attention during the past year to the things that keep us going during the hard times, the things that give us hope when we might otherwise fall into despair. We've realized on a deeper level than ever before how much we depend on things like our families, our friends, and our pets. We've experienced the pain of losing so much human contact, but we've also deepened our appreciation of the connections that we may have been taking for granted. And we've come to celebrate new ways of reaching out. I can remember a day before Zoom became a lifeline rather than just a convenience. So this morning, I will talk about optimism, and I'll also talk about hope and why I think they're two different things. And I want to start with some insights from our religious heritage. Our Unitarian Universalist faith grows out of two strands of theology, both of which are profoundly optimistic at their core. But those two forms of optimism sprang from very different sources. The Universalists were optimistic because of their view of God. They had come to a belief that a just and loving God could not possibly damn anyone to eternal salvation, to eternal suffering, and that all souls would find harmony with God, if not in this lifetime, then in the next. So they could be optimistic about their ultimate spiritual destiny, not because of their own virtue and worthiness, but because of God's immense love and compassion. The Unitarians, on the other hand, grounded their optimism in their understanding of human nature. They also believed in a divine force that was working for the good, but they emphasized our human potential to do good, to improve ourselves and improve the world. It's from our Unitarian heritage that we find phrases like the progress of mankind onward and upward forever, and salvation by character. So when John Smith and I first spoke about this sermon, he reminded me of an essay by James Luther Adams, an influential 20th century theologian who was himself a Unitarian Universalist. And he quoted to me a line from Adams' book, On Being Human Religiously. I knew I had read the book years ago, and sure enough, I found it on my shelf with a broken spine and loose pages falling out, highlighted and underlined with many scribbled notes in the margins. The book was published in 1976, and I devoured it in an undergraduate religion course just a few years later. In the essay John was remembering, Adams identifies 5 key points that he calls the 5 smooth stones of liberalism, borrowing the image of the stones that David used to defeat Goliath in the story from Hebrew Scripture. I could spend the whole sermon on his 5 points, but for our purposes this morning, I'll jump straight to the 5th, the one that John quoted to me. Finally, liberalism holds that the resources, divine and human, that are available for the achievement of meaningful change justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. And then he adds, this view does not necessarily involve immediate optimism. An attitude of ultimate optimism. Now, in modern informal usage, we've come to hear that word ultimate as meaning the most, the best, super optimism. But Adams is using it differently. He's using it literally. The ultimate thing is the thing you get to in the end. It's the last thing. We're not there yet. We might not be there for a long time. That's why he goes on to say this view does not necessarily involve immediate optimism. It's an important distinction. When I hear the word optimism, usually what I think of is a belief, an assumption that things are going to turn out well, usually in the short term. Rose-colored glasses, everything's going to be okay. But when Adams talks about ultimate optimism, he's taking a much longer view. He's talking about what I would call hope, or even faith, the possibility of things getting better. He goes on to remind us that we can't ignore or neglect the realistic and even tragic dimensions of our human behavior and experience. Those things are real. But he still believed that we could live with what he called a dynamic hope, because he believed that there were resources, both divine and human, available to us that made meaningful change possible. Not inevitable, but possible. Now, many of us these days are a lot more comfortable thinking about human resources than divine ones. We tend to put our faith in our human agency and our human will to make things better. But I'll be circling back to my understandings of those divine resources in a little while, because when we feel powerless or overwhelmed, as we sometimes do, just resting on our own human potential and perfectibility may not feel like enough. In fact, it can be painfully self-defeating, carrying all that weight on our shoulders, thinking we have to do it all. Now, there's a lot of research that indicates that optimism is good for you. I've seen studies that argue that optimistic people have better mental health, higher levels of achievement, better sleep patterns, better physical health, and increased longevity. And I believe them. Genuine optimism is good. But a forced, always look on the bright side version of optimism, what one article I read called toxic positivity, can be just that, toxic. It can invalidate our pain and grief and encourage us to minimize or ignore difficult subjects and feelings. And it can leave us feeling somehow defective when we find ourselves wrestling with our demons and unable to feel optimistic. And yet those times of struggle are sometimes our greatest times of growth. Optimism without honesty about the pain of our lives and the world doesn't have sticking power. As Cornel West said in an interview I heard, wrestling with despair is a positive thing. You're only as strong in your hope as you are in your wrestling with despair. In this month's Soul Matters resources, on the theme of commitment, there's a quotation from Bell Hooks, a Black feminist scholar and activist. She writes, "The heart of justice is truth-telling, seeing ourselves and the world the way it is rather than the way we want it to be. More than ever before, we as a society need to renew a commitment to truth-telling." We often don't like truth-telling. It bumps up against the optimistic view we'd rather hold on to, not only an optimistic view of the world and our power to change it, but also an optimistic view of ourselves and our own goodness. I think about the resistance of so many well-intentioned white folks when we're confronted with the reality of white supremacist culture and our participation in it. Many of us don't want to see ourselves and the world the way it is. We don't want to wrestle with that despair. When we look deeply and honestly into the way things are, whether in the wider world or in our own very personal lives, we may not always feel optimistic, but that doesn't mean we can't have hope. The hope comes when we go a step beyond seeing things the way they are and also begin to imagine how they could be. There's a powerful reading from the Reverend Natalie Maxwell Fenimore in the book Centering, Navigating Race, Authenticity, and Power in Ministry. The book Centering is a series of essays by ministers of color in our movement, speaking honestly and powerfully about the experiences, about their pain, their despair, and their hope. Reverend Fenimore calls to mind Shirley Chisholm and writes, "Shirley Chisholm was asked why she, a Black woman, was running for president. 'You don't have a chance. Why are you doing that?' And she said, 'Because I am in love with the America that does not yet exist.'" And then Fenimore goes on to say, "And that's how Unitarian Universalism is also. I'm in love with the Unitarian Universalism that does not yet exist. But I have to hold both the love for that thing and the love for the reality. It does not yet exist. It will probably not exist in my lifetime. I don't think it will in that of my children, but I can't deny my love for it. You know, wanting to be there in that struggle. That's why I'm fighting." I wouldn't call Reverend Fenimore's words optimistic, but I would call them hopeful. She holds the tension of loving the very imperfect present reality, seeing it as it is, and loving a future vision that keeps her working. And somehow she's able to hold on to the hope of that vision and keep working, even though she doesn't expect to see the full fruition of that work in her own lifetime, and perhaps not even in the lifetime of her children. She can remain hopeful because she knows it is work worth doing, and she is in solidarity with others who are doing the same work. I'm aware right now of so many places where people are trying to remain hopeful, even though they don't feel optimistic. I think about the political divide in our nation. I think about the pandemic, the fight for racial justice, the struggle to acknowledge and work against white supremacy in our own movement. And then on top of these big socio-political issues, we each have our own very personal struggles in our relationships, in our jobs, in our homes, in our communities. And for many of us during these long months of isolation and anxiety, those may feel more immediate. It's hard to work on changing the world when you can't get yourself to get out of bed in the morning. So I want to circle back to those divine resources. When Dawn Starr sent me her selection for the chalice lighting, I loved it. Those words from Rebecca Parker, and especially this little bit, "Even when we have done all we can and life is still broken, there is still a universal love that has never broken faith with us and never will. This is the ground of our hope." My heart cried out, yes, as I read those words. And at the exact same time, I was thinking to myself, but I'm not sure I actually believe that's true. Is there a universal love that has never broken faith with us? I don't know about that. And I was immediately reminded of another passage from the same essay in James Luther Adams' work that John Smith got me reading again, where Adams says, the power of God is like a seed that grows of itself if humans will use their freedom to meet the conditions for its growth. It is not only a principle by which life may be guided, it is also a power that transforms life. And in the margins, my atheist undergraduate self had scribbled, why do I like this? What is the power of God? I didn't know what he meant. I didn't believe what he said, but it still spoke to my heart somehow. Again, from this month's Soul Matters packet, there was a quotation from the Reverend Galen Gingrich, UU minister, who wrote, faith is a commitment to live as if certain things are true, and thereby help to make them so. Faith is a commitment to live as if life is a wondrous mystery, as if life is good, as if love is divine, as if we are responsible for the well-being of those around us. I'm not at all sure I always believe in a universal love that will never break faith with us. But I know that when I live as if I believe that, I am more hopeful. And I am convinced that there is something stronger than my own, sometimes feeble, human strength and determination, some source of strength and hope that is beyond me. And I can call that a divine resource. It may not transcend human nature or exist outside of it. Maybe it's born out of the deep connections among human beings. I just know it's a lot bigger than my individual angst and struggle. And I turn to the words that Emma read from Teresa Soto. In this community, we hold hope close. We don't always know what comes next, but that cannot dissuade us. We don't always know just what to do, but that will not mean that we are lost in the wilderness. We rely on the certainty beneath, the foundation of our values and ethics. We are the people who return to love like a North Star and to the truth that we are greater together than we are alone. We return to love like a North Star and to the truth that we are greater together than we are alone. Maybe that's divine enough. This week, my sister sent me a video of a group of nuns in an enclosed monastery in Dublin who took part in the Jerusalem Viral Dance Challenge. Now, you probably know all about this. According to one article I read, you'd have to have been living under a rock not to know about this dance craze. But it was new to me. Apparently, people all over the world are making videos of themselves dancing to this fabulous, upbeat South African song called Jerusalem and posting the videos online. It started in Africa, but now it is literally all over the world. Once I found out about it, I started searching YouTube, and just as a very small sampling, I found videos featuring Irish policemen, Swiss policemen, the staff of Austrian airlines, women in saris in India, and Dominican nuns in Spain. But I didn't know anything about it being a worldwide craze when my sister sent me this video. I just watched the video of these nuns, part of the Redemptorist order. They live in seclusion. There they were, these heavy-set, mostly older, middle-aged women, wearing shapeless habits, most of them red, with white socks and heavy black shoes sticking out at the bottom. And they are dancing with their whole hearts and their whole bodies to this beautiful, lively South African music. Apparently, the sisters responded to a dare from their fellow Redemptorist fathers and brothers, who we also see dancing in the same video. The captions tell us that the sisters usually live a quiet existence at their Dublin monastery and devote their lives to prayer. It's not just a gimmick, one sister said of the viral dance. It was purposefully done as a prayer. The nuns hope their dancing will cheer people up in lockdown. Well, it didn't just cheer me up. It made my heart sing, even as it made me cry. It gave me hope to watch those women, so beautiful, so free, so alive. I could feel that universal love that I'm not sure I believe in, flowing through those nuns and into my heart as they danced their prayer. And I realized that it really doesn't matter whether I believe in that universal love or not. What matters is that I experience it. We all need the things that keep us going and give us hope. So whether it's your family, or your cat, or your hope of a better future, your vision for that future, or a group of dancing nuns, hold on to what opens your heart and connects you to others and keeps you going, because we're all in this together. So let us return to love like a North Star and to the truth that we are greater together than we are alone. And to help us remember that, let's sing together our closing hymn, There Is More Love Somewhere.